The Batman Universe Comic Podcast. Hey, this is Scott Snyder.
Hi, this is Denny O'Neil.
My name is Neil Adams.
And this is Paul Dini.
Hi, my name's Dan DiDio.
This is Kevin Conroy.
Hey, this is Francis Maniple.
Hi, this is Jim Lee, and you're listening to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Batman Universe Comic Podcast, episode number 240. Today I have with me two special hosts. They are...
This is Donovan.
And this is Ian.
And we are bringing you a special episode of the Comic Cast. We are here to review The Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade #1, which was a one-shot released in 2016. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is this popping up on the comics feed? Well, if you remember correctly, and you've been listening to the Comic Cast for quite some time, there's been a number of comic series that have come out over the years, more specifically in the last couple years. A lot of mini-series that are Batman-related that we haven't been covering because they're not part of main continuity. There's been a lot of one-shots and things like that. And we have in the past, we've done some specials on the Batman Universe specials for very specific one-shots and things like that. Like we did Batman Earth 1. We've done some other ones. But instead of rather doing it as a special over on that feed, I think since it's comic-related, let's do it here. There's a couple opportunities every once in a while for us to get an extra episode out because of the 5 Wednesdays per month. January just happens to be one of those 5 Wednesdays this time around. So normally we would have a week off and you'd have an extra episodes of Bat Books for Beginners. So this time around, instead of an extra episode of Bat Books for Beginners, you get an extra episode of Comic Cast. So not sure exactly how often we're going to do this. I'm hoping to do it once a month, but there's no guarantees there. Obviously, there's not 5 Wednesdays per month too. So if we do start doing this on a more regular basis, we might start releasing these on some other day besides Friday, like the Comic Cast normally releases. But the idea is the series and one-shots and things like that have come out since basically like 2011, since we started not covering everything every episode. And there's a lot of it. There's a ton of it. And then there's also some stuff that I'd like to go back to and actually cover as a more of a collected, more as like an entire story instead of just individual issues. There's things like that. There's also series, some of the Greater Gotham stuff, like Grayson, for example. Some of the Grayson stuff collected is really well done, and it would be great to cover it, but it makes more sense to cover it collected rather than individual issues. So that's the hope. Obviously, this is also the idea of starting to do these more often and cover some of this other stuff outside of the normal comic release stuff. It has a lot to do with us trying to expand what we cover on a normal basis because it is our 10th anniversary, and I'm feeling like we should be expanding our coverage as much as we possibly can. So we're going to have these specials come out, like I said, hopefully every month. We're going to kick it off with one that came out in 2016, The Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade #1. So if you've listened to the Comic Cast or ever before, or if this is your first time listening to the Comic Cast, basically the way it works is we normally give you a synopsis. It's full of spoilers generally, so just be warned. Obviously, you probably wouldn't be listening to this if you were just expecting us to review the book and not actually give you a synopsis based off of what we do on the Comic Cast. So the synopsis is going to be very spoiler filled. Then we're going to talk about some different things and discussion points related to the book, and then that's basically what we're going to do. Instead of being exactly like the Comic Cast, where basically one person leads the discussion with 2 or 3 questions, we're just going to have an open forum to talk about whatever we want to talk about, and the hosts are going to change every single episode. So let's dive straight into this book. So, The Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade #1 was written by Frank Miller and Brian Azzarello with art by John Romita Jr. The book opens up with the Joker being institutionalized in Arkham again after being caught by Batman, again after escaping from Arkham yet again. A fact that the Joker relishes. Cue the Miller Dark Knight staple, talking heads discussing how the apprehension of the Joker and whether or not the inclusion of Robin in Batman's activities could be considered child endangerment as they consider him to be a boy. The next morning, Robin is itching to get going on training, but an aging Batman delays him. The years have caught up with him, and he isn't bouncing back as quickly after a night of fighting. After medicating, he shows us that he still has quite a bit to offer sparring with Robin. Despite being older and slower, he overcomes Robin's assault with patience and strategy. The session is cut short by Alfred with news of a personal nature. A wealthy contemporary of Bruce Wayne has been found dead. Talking to the widow, he finds that his once level-headed friend has gotten involved in something something running through the family's wealth. With the Joker locked away in Arkham, his gang has moved on to other mischief-making. Batman and Robin bust in on them robbing a pharmacy. Again, Batman's aging and reflexes are highlighted through the initial fight and ensuing car chase. The situation is resolved quickly when the gang's van is run off the road. Batman does the hero thing and starts getting the gang out of the van before it explodes, only to allow another member to get the drop on him. Robin saves the day, but in a rather brutal manner, pretending not to enjoy it. But Batman knows the truth. Back in Arkham, the Joker gives a soliloquy on the nature of the natural perspective and forced perspective, while the inmates progressively get more agitated. The next day, Bruce Wayne is now retired, is with a now retired Selina Kyle. They discuss Bruce's aging and gets to the root of why he's not yet retired. Jason Todd isn't ready to be on his own. He also admits he isn't quite ready for the civilian life as of yet. There is another interlude of a commercial for Mothers Against Batman, criticizing him for taking the law into his own hands and dispensing violent judgment as he sees fits. That night, another of Gotham's wealthy residents is behaving bizarrely. This time, a man has taken his wife hostage to prove how much he loves her. But Batman and Robin dissolve the situation. Robin again takes things a step beyond Batman's comfort zone, choosing to disarm the man by not knocking away the gun, but attacking his arm. Soon after, Batman and Alfred have the talk about Jason. He is cold and lacks empathy. Batman has been choosing very skilled proteges, but none have matched his brilliance. Taking in the clues from the behavior of the men, he has determined Poison Ivy must be a possible culprit. Old-fashioned detective work ties the two victims to a company called Green Vein. Very on the nose there. In Arkham, the Joker's plan is taking shape as his control over the inmates has begun to take hold. Batman and Robin's search for Green Vein takes them naturally to a sewage plant. Here, Batman takes the lead and has Robin ride the bench. He encounters Killer Croc within the plant, who seems to be running communications for her. While he is brokering a deal with the latest wealthy victim, Batman unwittingly makes his presence known, further hammering home the idea that Batman has lost a step. Croc gets the drop on him in the ensuing skirmish, receiving one heck of a beating. As Croc continues to rain down pain, the police show up, called to the scene by Robin. Batman, in a more physical and emotional pain, discusses with Selina Kyle whether or not he is addicted to being Batman. There's another interlude showing a TMZ-style Gotham gossip show reporting on the injuries sustained to the third victim who escaped the scene of the fight the previous night. Batman and Robin tail him to the Gotham Botanical Gardens, where we find his obsession, and that of the previous victims, is in fact Poison Ivy. Simultaneously, across town, the Joker instigates his plan, a well-timed full-scale riot which covers the nonchalantly strolling out the front door of Arkham into the night. Back at the garden, we see that Poison Ivy has a menagerie of wealthy men under her influence, and she's been using them for money and gifts. A fight ensues where Ivy orders the men under her control to fight on her behalf. Whereas Batman acknowledges the innocence of the men and takes them down as gently as possible, Robin goes full force against them. In that moment, Batman realizes that he trained Robin to be an attack dog. He calls out to him to back off the violence, but that allows Killer Croc to get the drop on him yet again. Beatings come again while Robin finishes off the victims of Ivy's control. Eventually, Batman gains the upper hand and beats down Croc while Robin captures Ivy. The news reports that Joker escaped from Arkham, and Batman admits that he is in no shape to handle the Joker due to the abuse that he suffered from Killer Croc. Robin insists on going back out to deal with the Joker situation, but is shut down. They both need to rest before they can deal with anything else. Robin lurks momentarily in the shadows while Batman and Alfred continue their talk on legacy and that Jason Todd isn't ready to take up the mantle and may never be. He's wild and headstrong and enjoys the fight too much. The pair resolve that Jason is not beyond saving and that Batman has to teach him better than himself. Fortunately, Robin has ignored Batman's advice and gone after the Joker. Goons get the jump on him, and the rest of the story is a familiar one if you've read Death in the Family. Close in on the Joker smiling. All right, so first thing I want to talk about is, did you really feel like this was a Frank Miller type story? I mean, this is Frank Miller with Brian Azzarello. It's not just a straight Frank Miller story like the original Dark Knight Returns or even Dark Knight Strikes Again. But did you feel as if this story was slightly muted compared to some of Frank Miller's other takes on Batman?
It's definitely restrained in the way that, like, for the most part, I could tell what was going on. Which I've not been able to tell what was going on for a number of most of Frank Miller's Batman stories post Dark Knight. I see what you're saying, that like the narrative is much clearer, and I think it's easier to kind of follow. I wasn't really getting. I don't know if I actually put in the effort to understand the Joker scenes, what he was talking about. I mean, I was kind of just watching the artwork, but where Batman was concerned, yeah, it was very kind of like plain language. But it did not feel like a Miller story. I think that like John Romita Jr.'s pencils, especially with Klaus Jansen's inks, Klaus Janson inked Miller back in the Dark Knight Returns days, like it evoked enough of the kind of like the imagery and the aesthetic of Dark Knight Returns. Like Batman's costume is kind of like in that first chapter where he kind of has the leg belt and like the yellow oval. It looks enough like it to where it's not like a totally different story, but it feels right because it takes place about like 10 years before. And it's it's not as crazy as that book got, but so I think it was kind of a restrained story that maybe Azzarello helped on the script, but it didn't feel totally alien. So I would guess yes and no.
It's hard for me to tell what quote unquote real Frank Miller is because he's had at least 3 distinct voices that he's written with. There's his young and hungry voice that you see in the original Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One and Daredevil Born Again. And I would say that's definitely where he's the most both creative and controlled. And then there's his incredibly crazy period where he did All-Star Batman and Robin, Dark Knight Strikes Again, bunch of other stuff. I would say Sin City is probably a transition from his more controlled stuff to his really, really crazy stuff. And then he started partnering with people, and that sort of restrained him. But I think it also has muted some of his genius. Like I am not a fan of Dark Knight Returns. I don't find it terribly interesting, but it is one of the most controlled works of art that I've read. It's just incredibly well crafted. And I think that Daredevil Born Again and Batman Year One are true masterpieces. Like just the way he constructs characters and scenes, especially collaborating with great artists like David Mazzucchelli, he is unparalleled in his ability to write that street level vigilante. This is a lesser Frank Miller. It is good, but it's not to that level of those 80s works. Paradoxically, because he's so much older now, it's much better at capturing what it's like to be an old man doing the kinds of crazy stuff Batman does. So I look at, his action scenes with Killer Croc and I'm reminded of the fight with the mutants in Dark Knight Returns. And I'm just like, this is supposed to be him 10 years earlier? And he's like failing with Killer Croc and Poison Ivy takes him down. Whereas with the mutants, he was just like a machine. So, it's funny. This is lesser, but it's also in some ways more seasoned. So there's more insights, I think, that has to offer sometimes.
I definitely agree. And I like how you said that there's 3 different versions of Frank Miller, because I think that's extremely true. Mm-hmm. Some of these versions or some of the more recent stuff that we've seen from him, specifically the DK3, Dark Knight 3, the Master Race, a lot of people, including us over on the Comic Cast, said that didn't always feel like Frank Miller. And sometimes the only Frank Miller that actually felt like it was happening was some of the stuff that was happening in the backups, which I don't think
because he was drawing those.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. I think a lot of it also had to do with the fact that it did feel more like Dark Knight Returns, a lot less like Dark Knight Strikes Again. I think that's where the comparison comes from, where, we all know that Frank Miller wrote both of those series, but they're very, very different. Just like you said, there's almost like there's 3 different versions of Frank Miller. So the interesting thing for me is I definitely feel I can feel Brian Azzarello's influence here. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as stated, it is Frank Miller's 3rd stage where he's basically working with other people, and it is slightly muted. You can tell that there is a distinct difference between some of the stuff, and you can tell, like, some of the stuff you just brought up, Ian, with like, this is only supposed to be 10 years before Dark Knight Returns, yet for some reason he's struggling taking on certain villains, despite the fact that in Dark Knight Returns he doesn't have those issues even without the armored suit. So it's interesting to me because it feels like that's an Azzarello aspect that he's adding to the story, or that's his influence on the story. That might not be the case, but that's how it feels like it is to me. So the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting about this issue isn't technically truly a graphic novel, because it is much smaller than normal. It's only about 64 pages, which I say 64 pages.
Killing Joke Lane.
Yeah, it's basically like it's two issues basically. Nowadays comics, you can probably get a comic $4.99 for 32 pages. I think Doomsday Clock is like that right now with 32 pages for that price. And it's basically 2 times that. Now the price when it originally released was $6.99, which for 64 pages, at least compared to what today's prices are, it's actually not that bad of a deal. But it does feel as if the story could have been more if given the extra pages, or the story could have been longer. And maybe this was all the story that there was to tell, and that was it. And that's why it ended up only being this. That's entirely possible. But it just feels like there could have been other aspects of Batman's life, dived into more history about the Robins and the former proteges within this confines of this universe. It feels like there could have been more added to it if they wanted to. Now, certainly, if this was what they intended on doing, was just doing something like this, like you said, Don, the same size as Killing Joke, something like that. If that's what they were aiming for, okay, fine. It just feels like there could have been something more. How did you guys feel about that?
I gotta say that, not to kind of show my hand too early, but I was very impressed with the story. I've not really loved a Frank Miller Batman story since year one, if we're going chronologically in terms of when this came out. I was actually just talking to Bertoni earlier tonight, saying that like All-Star Batman and Robin's artwork is excellent, but the writing is not, as everyone knows.
That writing is insane.
Yeah. This I felt was sort of when they announced the story, I was like, I don't really care to read that, and I kind of just read it just out of morbid curiosity. But I felt that this was a really well done story, and they could have told more about because the Dark Knight Returns universe is always very vague. It acknowledges there's a DC universe, but we don't get terms of eras. We don't know if there's a Teen Titans, or we know there's a Justice League, but we don't know how many heroes are on there besides what they show in Dark Knight Strikes Again. So they keep it vague, and I kind of like that. I don't necessarily. I personally wasn't needing to know more about where's Lucius Fox or where's the other characters. I thought that what they showed this was fine enough. So I thought it was fine. I wasn't necessarily wanting more, as brief as it was, because the storytelling was sounded so compact. I was happy with what they gave us.
I think the big thing, and the reason I say this is lesser Frank Miller, is because if you look at his previous stuff, he's either incredibly spare or incredibly interlaced. So year one's just really spare. He's straightforward. He has absolutely no wasted time, no wasted panels in year one. It's straight shot, beginning to end. This is Batman. This is Gordon. This is why it exists. Dark Knight Returns is full of interlace. It's got so many mirrorings and thematic parallels, and everything is just so tightly constructed together, even though it's a Baroque story that goes in so many bizarre directions. It's all there for a purpose. I feel like here you've got 3 major villains. You've got Joker, Ivy, and Killer Croc. None of them connect thematically to Bruce's struggle of aging and his legacy, the darkness in Jason. So there's not really a sense that it had to be Joker, Ivy, and Croc. It could have been Two-Face, Penguin, and Man-Bat. It doesn't feel like the Joker, Ivy, and Croc are there for anything other than the Joker's iconicness, and we know he has to kill Jason. But I feel like, that's just because I didn't really, like Donovan, I didn't read the Joker part super seriously. But I do think that there's just not the same level of craftsmanship as you see in his earlier stuff. So I think that's probably why it either feels too long or too short. I think it's fine. It's definitely high quality storytelling with John Romita Jr. and Frank Miller's gift for dialogue, but it doesn't seem to mean more than just the story of how Jason Todd died.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would land on that exactly, because the larger story is kind of why Batman retired, which is kind of, explains the lead up to Dark Knight Returns. And although the selling point was this, you finally see the lost tale between how this Jason died, which really turned me off when they announced it. I think what surprised me was that this is more of a Batman, a Bruce Wayne story, and Jason figures into this, but Jason's not the main character. And I kind of liked that approach, because it does kind of bleed more into sort of the justification for, the onset of the Dark Knight Returns point of view, because I think it kind of plays into things that would have had to happen. He was getting older, he was questioning himself, and he was unsure of how he would continue his legacy. And with Jason gone, he just stops everything. I think that even though there's not as large of a sort of labyrinthian sort of thematics going on as DKR was, I don't think it had to be. And I think that what it does tell is necessary to kind of justify itself, even if that is sort of a relatively smaller thing.
Yeah, definitely agree. It's just well crafted, but I feel like it's totally unnecessary because we already knew, because he mentioned, Robin died, and like all of the events are referred to in DKR. So I think that while this is definitely fun, it's a good read. I just, when you think about the legacy of Frank Miller, sure, the completionists are going to have this, you've got probably the completionists will put it before Dark Knight Returns chronologically. So you get Last Crusade, Dark Knight Returns, Dark Knight Strikes Again, Dark Knight Master Race, you get all that. But I think if you look at like what gets passed down from fan to fan, it's going to be Dark Knight Returns. And there's going to be a smaller audience that loves Dark Knight Strikes Again. And then probably people who grew up in the era that Dark Knight Master Race was being published will like that too. But it's Dark Knight Returns that's going to be remembered. And I think that this, while well crafted, isn't going to have the same kind of impact.
I definitely agree with that. There's no I don't think there's a debate about whether or not this will be remembered in the same category as something like Dark Knight Returns by any means. But I think that, just because it's a well-crafted story doesn't make it a memorable one. I mean, like, ultimately they're retelling a story just in a different universe. And I think I also enjoyed this issue, this story, but I don't think that just because the individual issue is good or great makes it as good or great as something like Dark Knight Returns. I mean, even though it's in that same universe, it's set in that same world, I just don't feel like, honestly, it's one of those things where when you read a story, my thought process is always, if you take it out, if you've got multiple volumes and you have the first volume is this, second volume is that, third volume is this is kind of like the prelude to volume 1, so you could consider it volume 1, I guess, if you really wanted to, chronologically, that is. And the question is, if you take out this volume, does it matter? Does it affect anything else? And no, it doesn't. I don't think that it affects Dark Knight Returns at all. I mean, like, if anything, it just sets the stage, tells us kind of what happened with the Robin, with Robin, that is, and why there's such a disdain for Joker. But I mean, like, you don't really need to know that in order to appreciate what happens to Dark Knight Returns. I think that's where the concern is that can you tell a story that is part of another story that takes place either before or after, and if it doesn't change anything, is it really something that's super memorable? And I don't think it is. I mean, like, I have no problem admitting that this was a well-crafted issue and it was a good story, but I don't feel like it's going to be remembered for, it's not going to be in the, it's not going to be listed off on the top 10 list of Batman comics, or probably even the top 25.
Well,
at that point,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think at that point, it's a matter of, is it an observation that you could go with you through your life without reading it, or is an active detriment to its own existence? Dark Knight Returns is a great story, but I don't necessarily, it's not, the bed that like my Batman rock was founded on exactly. I mean, in some ways it was because it's so influential, but like, I don't hold that story in such a regard that any other story that shares its name has to be as good. Otherwise it annoys me. So
It's not that it's annoying. It's just that I'm just saying, like, I definitely am there with you in saying that, Dark Knight Returns is not something that I literally say this is the epitome of what Batman books should be. I'm not there either, because this wasn't a book that changed my life. I mean, there's plenty of people and writers out there who are currently writing on books that said when they were in college, they read Dark Knight Returns and it changed their entire thought process behind comics and things like that. I'm not one of those people. This book came out when I was, Dark Knight Returns, that is, came out when I was like 2 or 3 years old. So it's not like it has a humongous effect on me. Yes, it influenced other things, but what I'm saying is, look at it from the perspective of, is this going to be a story that is memorable? So you just answered that question.
Well, whether it is or not, I think that, I don't know if we should judge stories on whether or not they're memorable. We should judge them whether they're good.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, comparing it to some of the other titles, would you, something like Dark Knight Returns, is it as memorable? Does it have a lasting effect as something like that? Judging it, saying it's good or bad is a completely different thing. I'm just saying, like, comparing it to some of the other great Batman works, do you think it's on par?
I think there's something that I was thinking about when I was doing my prep, is that a lot of what Miller and Azzarello thinks about in Last Crusade is this idea of legacy and how Jason isn't ready and might never be. And that's a whole nother... The discussion of Jason's characterization is something that I think we should touch on, but what I'm getting at is this was written in the middle of Dark Knight Master Race. And that book is almost like the, not origin story, but it is the big graduation of Carrie Kelly from Robin to first Batman impersonator, then Batgirl, and finally Batwoman. And she is, at least in Dark Knight Master Race, clearly promoted as a worthy legacy. And so I think that one of the things that Last Crusade is doing for Frank Miller is exploring what's the wrong legacy. Why is Carrie Kelly a good legacy, and why was Jason wrong? And so I think in that it does have a certain value. I mean, I'm a Bat Family fan first and foremost. Batman is good, but I care more about the family he forms around himself. So this exploration of that relationship is probably the strongest element for me. And so I think in that sense it will last. But in terms of having influence or really being something that people will return to and reread, other than for, I think, probably the craftsmanship, is not really going to change anything like Dark Knight Returns did. Dark Knight Returns was a major tonal shift. This is basically more of the same with excellent craftsmanship.
I definitely agree.
I think that, like, my final word would just kind of be me repeating myself in the way that, like, I think if you were to answer the question, is this going to be a memorable Batman story in the next decade or so, I think it would be very interesting if it was, because I think the easy answer would be no. Once you say no, the next question would be, okay, what does it offer in its own merits? And that kind of, to me, it's kind of a very brief stop in terms of the discussion of the story, rather than sort of, kind of holy and high, because I think you kind of just arrive at that with any other story. Although I do understand the question, because it is a Dark Knight Returns kind of tie-in. Yeah,
I agree. I think that in terms of, is this a story that if you came back to it 10 years later, would you read it and enjoy it? I think the answer is yes. I think it's well crafted, and so it will hold up. I mean, there's tons of great Batman stories like that. Like, I've read a couple like Denny O'Neil stories from the 1970s. I have no idea what was going on in continuity, but they're just good, solid stories. But do I think that they're quote unquote important? Nah.
I mean, at this point, I think the only stories that are actually important are the ones that introduce characters or play into certain things that kind of develop the characters. Like Nightfall is important because it introduces Bane and introduces, the idea of replacing Batman, because I think that was the first time that's ever been done. But, like, otherwise, you just have to get to your, Detective Comic 38s and Detective 259s and all that kind of stuff, rather than if a story is important or not, because it's always, vulnerable to continuity, and whatever editor sees what counts and what doesn't.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And I think a part of that has to do with the fact that nowadays, the way comics are is if there can be great single issues, like, for example, this is going back to last year, but when Tom King told the Batman Catwoman story where the two of them were on the rooftop, it's a great single issue. I love that single issue. Is that super memorable? No, I mean, I remember it because it wasn't even a year ago, but am I going to still remember that story and bring it up in like 2-3 years? Probably not. But as a standalone single story, it was really well done. And especially given the stuff that he was currently doing at the time, that was probably some of the best stuff that he had done at the time. That being said, it's definitely one of those things where nowadays it feels as if the important stuff that most people are going to remember is, like you said, Don, the things that either introduce new characters, or the other part is massive events like something like Nightfall, or something that just, like you said, develops the characters in some different, unique way. One of the things that I find interesting about this is, there has been talk over this was before DK3 wrapped up. But before DK3 wrapped up, there was actually talk out there talking about that there was a potential that Frank Miller had this idea for a fourth volume. Even though they went into Dark Knight 3 with the idea that was going to be the final one, they said it was going to be the final one, and then all of a sudden halfway through, he said he had ideas for a fourth volume. Now, if they continue to do it, and I remember on the Comic Cast we had talked about this, where, was there the potential to basically have an ongoing series that was part of the Dark Knight universe. They had introduced multiple characters, and focused on them and developed some of the other heroes within the Dark Knight universe. One of the main complaints that we had with DK3 on the Comic Cast was that it didn't feel like a Batman story. It was more of a Superman story. Frank Miller has said that he has a Superman story in mind within the Dark Knight, within the confines of the Dark Knight universe.
Oh God!
So
Wait, isn't he doing Superman Year One or something?
I'm not sure. I don't know enough. I don't pay attention that much to the Batman stuff. But if it is taking place within, I mean, that makes sense. But I just remember him saying he had ideas for 4th volumes. There was talk. I remember us talking about on the Comic Cast that there was multiple rumors that they could be potentially starting a new universe within the confines of the DC universe, but just have it be like an Elseworlds type universe where it was all Dark Knight 3 stuff, and they could do different stories, different minis, different focus on different characters that were part of the universe that were introduced, and that would explain partially why there were so many other characters that popped in DK3 was that idea. Now, none of that has actually happened, and it's been a little bit of time since the DK3 wrapped up. None of that has actually happened. Nothing's been said. We haven't heard anything since DK3 wrapped up. But if it was to be true where they were starting this pocket universe where they could tell stories as part of this Dark Knight universe and things like that, I think that this story actually could be considered one of the better groups of stories, at least in the beginning, because honestly, I didn't like DK3 all that much. I mean, like, it's not.
It was kind of
really.
It's not horrible like Strikes Again, but it was not like I didn't like it. Like I said, I felt like more of a Superman / what Justice League member can make a guest appearance per issue than it did an actual Batman story. It just felt like Batman was involved. It was more of like a Dark Knight 3, the Justice League. In my
I didn't
mind,
even finish it. I dropped it after I was not the reviewer anymore.
Yeah, I mean, like I just didn't enjoy it that much. I'm not going to say it was poorly done or anything like that. It's definitely better than Strikes Again. But this issue, the Last Crusade, was actually probably one of the the better moments that I had with the return of the Dark Knight universe stuff, was because when I read this and I thought, wow, this is really good. It's a good story. It's not completely, ripping apart characters that we already know. Sure, the characters are slightly different than, the normal universe, but that makes sense because it takes place in this, this alternate universe. But that being said, like, if you were to start a pocket universe, this probably, I think, would be super memorable if there was an ongoing continuation of that Dark Knight universe, because this is a really good story as part of it. And when you compare it to DK3, Strikes Again, it doesn't really hold up. Now, yes, Dark Knight Returns is by far much better in my opinion. But when you're combining all of the Dark Knight universe stories together, this actually is a really good story and much better in my opinion than DK3 and Strikes Again.
I think there's two things going on. Frank Miller is doing Superman Year One. If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably loosely connected to his entire body of work, because he thinks that Batman Year One is the same universe as Dark Knight Returns. Editorial doesn't agree with him, but he's the one writing it, so he's going to write it that way. When he was expressing his interest in writing a 4th Dark Knight story, my read was that he enjoyed doing what he was doing on Dark Knight 3, but he really was frustrated at the lack of control. I think Miller benefits from a co-writer, but he also loses a lot, and he knows it. He knows that he's not creating at the top of his game when he's with a co-writer. And so I think that when he was talking about doing a 4th one, that's really what it was doing. I think the other thing that happened in the last 2 years is, of course, Rebirth. And that is the expansion or inclusion of Watchmen, the other major thing in the 80s that changed DC Comics into normal continuity of some sort. We still haven't, obviously, Doomsday Clock is still going on right now, so we don't know how that's going to play out. But I think DC doesn't have a lot of juice to push multiple nostalgia-driven stories, especially when one of them's directly connected to their cash cow of the main continuity, and the other one is basically just an artistic pet project. So I think we're not going to see an ongoing Dark Knight series. We're not going to see like it being integrated into the canon as a possible future, the way that Batman Beyond was, or the Titans of Tomorrow have been recently. I think that unless Frank Miller gets significantly more healthy and energetic, we're going to see Superman Year One in the next 4 years, and then we'll see where he goes from there. But I think that DC doesn't have people they want to put on a Dark Knight universe ongoing, or even like a quarterly or even a yearly. They just don't have people. They're putting all their energy in this Watchmen stuff. And Miller is, I mean, he's not in great shape, I don't think.
Well, that's been the conversation for a couple of years now. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me because, like, beyond the first issue, out of morbid curiosity, I probably won't be reading it because they've there is a sense of dilution with these Dark Knight stories, because beyond the 80s stuff, who has adored this series? They're just big sellers because of the name. I think that like everyone kind of recognizes that, whether you liked or disliked these like, you know, post Year One, post Dark Knight Returns books, it's name recognition more than actual quality. And even though Miller is an icon in the industry, I mean, I would say that his last great work was Sin City, and since then it's just been kind of selling the name because his own perspectives are so insular and known only to him that like some of his stuff is just ridiculed off the map. And that's not me like kind of being mean or whatever. That's just kind of like, you know, the situation.
No, you're absolutely right. That is the critical consensus.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I was also looking up when you said the thing about Superman Year One that was announced back in July of 2015 at San Diego. There at DC's Masterclass panel, it was announced, and there was basically no word on when it's happening other than John Romita Jr. was going to be doing it. It was supposed to be a 100-page graphic novel. That's all the only details that were ever revealed by it. To put in perspective, for those of you out there who don't keep track of comic news and announcements and things like that, there are certain projects that get announced way, way, way before they're ever even close to being done. A recent example of this is Batman Creature of the Night. It's currently a 4-issue miniseries that's being published from Kurt Busiek and John Paul Leon as the artist. But the series itself was first hinted at way back in 2011, where it was first revealed that it was going to be happening, and then it wasn't until 2017 where it was actually solicited, so 6 years later. And this has happened before. Batman Europa was one that was announced like 3 years before it actually ended up happening. I want to say, off the top of my head, there's been a couple of other ones. More recently, there was a couple of other ones. But anyway, the point is, stuff sometimes gets announced way before. Oh, there's still a project out there that supposedly Mark Silvestri has been working on that was announced back in like 2012. That he, every once in a while, we receive this random update saying that, you know, he's still working on it, you know, 5-6 years later. So the point is, even if there's a graphic novel coming Superman Year One, who knows when that's going to happen. Now, the interesting thing was I did find an interview that was done with Frank Miller. This was around the time of like halfway through DK3, where he said that Brian Azzarello was, because Brian Azzarello was working with him on Volume 3, he was going to be doing Volume 4 by himself. And even though his name appeared on the last couple issues, the way the interview went, and who knows if this is just because he had a bad day or whatever, or DC publicity wasn't, you know, with him or what, but it seemed as if, based off the interview, that he basically was saying that, hey, I'm going to be doing a Volume 4 because Brian Azzarello has basically strong-armed me into, you know, taking over DK3. Basically, his exact words were, I thoroughly applaud what Brian's doing, but now that he's doing this, it's now a 4-part series. I'm going to do the 4th. So it's interesting because he's saying, I applaud what Brian's doing, but he was supposed to, you know, he was a co-writer on it, he got top billing on it. So the question is, did he get top billing just for the sake of it? And this was actually Brian Azzarello's story, just as a way for DC to sell it, or something else. So, I mean, like, that's something to consider too. But That's
There's
just
no
talking about the
question that
longevity.
DC would put Frank Miller's name on toilet paper if they thought it would sell.
That's true.
So I think, I mean, I really do think that he was frustrated with the lack of control. And I think that's where those comments came from. That was the interview I was referencing. But like I said, I don't think he's doing that well. So we'll see if he ever has the energy to make that come to pass.
Yeah. And sometimes some things are better left unannounced, unrevealed, for the sake of just not letting it be. I mean, we went into DK3 as it billed as the final chapter in the Dark Knight Returns series. And then, like, it wasn't even a month after the first issue was released that he was saying those comments. So it is what it is. Anyway, other things to discuss. You guys have anything that you'd like to discuss?
I'll try to do it because I actually have to go very soon and just something just coming up. But I think the only point I'll say is that, like, and I think Ian can probably kind of follow this up, that I really like how this feels kind of like an alternate version of how things would have turned out. It doesn't feel too singular towards the Dark Knight Returns thing, because it's, you know, like Bruce is getting old, Jason's gotten older, he's gotten darker, and, you know, there's a lot of kind of back and forth as to how dark Jason was in the original comics and how dark it should be kind of retroactively. But I like it where it's just kind of, you know, little moments, you know, kind of imply that he enjoys kind of hurting people, you know, kind of disobeying things, kind of being really anxious. And I love that scene at the end where Batman actually says, we need a rest, we're staying in bed. Like, and you always see Batman kind of like disobey Alfred and do that, and Jason's the one kind of rush back out there. I really like that. And I thought that, like, the portrayal of the Batman and Robin relationship in this, because it's Jason Todd, was really cool. And I love the artwork as well. I thought that, like, they were illustrated really well. So again, this story really impressed me because I really wasn't looking forward to it when it was announced. And when I read it, I genuinely enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite stories of the year. And I think that maybe it won't stand the test of time in terms of, you know, notoriety, but I'll certainly remember it for a while, because I think that this was, like, I approved of every kind of characterization they had in this, even though I thought the Joker stuff was a bit impenetrable. That didn't really bother me. So, yeah, I just liked kind of the Batman and Robin dynamic in this. As dark as it was, I thought it was appropriately dark.
All right.
Okay, so did you have anything else to talk about, or did you want to jump on to that point?
Well, I think Donovan makes really excellent points. I think that I think what he said about how it doesn't seem it's like necessarily tied to being Dark Knight Returns. Like, obviously it does slide very neatly into that slot, but it could also just be, this is the way it would go with Batman if you had stopped telling stories in the 80s and this is just the way that Batman continuity would play out. There's a big contingent of Jason Todd fans, obviously. That's why the Red Hood book is still a thing 7 years after it started. People love Jason Todd. And when you say things like, oh, Jason was too reckless, you know, like they get really mad at you. I have not read The Diplomat's Son. I've seen some pages from it, but I haven't read it. So I don't know historically if Jason Todd was the quote-unquote wild or dangerous or dark Robin. But that's certainly the narrative that DC has gone with for the last, well, since he came back in 2005. He's the dark Robin, the Robin who Batman failed, who may or may not have failed Batman, and who became something of a villain. So I think that the way this book examines Jason Todd is perhaps why I think this could be an intriguing expansion. Like if they did decide to put another artist and writer on the Dark Knight universe, I'd be interested in seeing more of this Jason, because in Dark Knight Returns, Jason hadn't died. Death in the family hadn't happened when Dark Knight Returns said he was dead. So we don't know if this Jason has the same backstory of stealing the hubcaps off the Batmobile. Like, seeing that relationship would be, I think, a very interesting choice.
I definitely agree. I think that, honestly, the thing is, I'm always a huge fan of how things become how they are. I like learning how, you know, those of the people out there, listeners out there who listen to me talk about Detective Comics and about how recently I've been talking about Mudface and how I really hope the Mudface stuff gets explained, or First Victim, which I'm sure that stuff will based off the latest issue. I'm sure that some of that stuff is going to get explained, but it's one of those things where I really want to know how things became how they are. You know, I want to know how the relationships became established the way they are. It's just that's how I am. I always want to learn the history of things. If Stella was here, she'd give me crap because I said the word history. So the history, so I'll do it because she's not here. But basically, the idea is, I love the idea. So I mean, like, if they were to do something where it was a continuation or even more of a prelude to this specific story, that would be interesting. It would be interesting to see how exactly everything came to be the way it is. You know, definitely there's things that are different. Bruce is actually still a little bit older than he is. Well, he's probably about 10 years older than what he is currently in normal continuity. So it's not as if, you know, this is still taking place in the future. Even if you went a little bit further back, you jumped another 10 years back, you know, you could learn the story of the other Robins that they're referencing and things like that. It would be, some of that stuff would be really cool to learn, to figure out. So definitely agree that if they were to expand, although I do not think it's necessary for them to stay true to keeping Frank Miller on these titles, I definitely think that there is definitely room for them to expand if they wanted to.
Let's see. I have a couple notes. Let's see if we have hit all of them. I think the last thing I had was in Dark Knight Returns, there's a real sense that Batman enjoys being Batman. Now, that could just be the thrill of being back after being retired for 10 years. But him saying, I never enjoyed hurting criminals, and Jason does, seems a bit contradictory to what you see in Dark Knight Returns. So I think that's part of the effect I mentioned at the beginning, where Frank Miller is much older. He's 30 years older than when he wrote and drew Dark Knight Returns. And I think that his perspective, his ability to write an older Batman has grown. So I would be very curious to see what his idea of Batman is. I mean, I'm almost tempted, not completely because it was kind of a slog, but almost tempted to go back and reread Dark Knight 3 just to see what his Batman is like in that one.
I can assure you, you're not missing out on a whole lot. And I don't say that, you know, I don't say that half-heartedly. We reviewed all 8 issues, and if it wasn't for Ed pushing us to review that on the main comic cast, we probably would have skipped it because it was outside of continuity, and ever since that specific series, I have held true to the outside of continuity because there's been some great stuff that's released recently, and I've just stuck to if it's outside of continuity, we're just not going to cover it. Honestly, like, if there's fans out there and listeners who read Dark Knight 3 and really enjoyed it, feel free to comment and tell me I'm an idiot and tell me why you enjoyed it. I'd love to read those on one of the upcoming Comic Cast episodes that we have. But I just didn't really enjoy it. I mean, like I said, I just felt like it was more of like a Superman story. There was way too many members of the Justice League that were appearing just for the sake of seemingly appearing. It felt like every episode or every issue had a guest appearance by somebody, and then they somehow got played into the story. Sure, but it just, I don't know.
Well, the fact that they expanded it by an issue. I mean, the fact that they went from, was it 7 to 8? I think it was.
It was 8 to 9.
8 to 9. It's just like, it was clearly a cash grab on DC's part. Like, there was not enough story to fill that many issues.
Yeah, there really wasn't. I mean, the thing is, there was also, the other part of it was also the price point was higher than most of the other books. The first issue sold, like, they had a crazy number of variants for the first issue. First issue sold like 250,000 copies or something, or I think it was even higher than that. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but it was crazy high. And at the time, I hadn't seen anything even come close to that as far as DC's Batman sales numbers and things like that. So it was insane numbers, and by any means, it was one of those things. By the time it was done, because there was a delay, the Last Crusade came out in the middle of it where they said they were taking a break, but the break ended up being longer. Then the issue started coming out every 2 months instead of every month, and it just kind of got dragged down by the fact that it was like, just end this, kill it while it's, like, put it out of its misery. Okay,
well, I mean, I'm looking at Doomsday Clock. If you count both,
the exact same thing.
If you look at Doomsday Clock lenticular plus the regular, it sold almost 250,000. It was like
it didn't sell as well. I remember that when the first issue came out for Doomsday.
It also didn't have as many crazy variants.
That's true. Doomsday Clock, although I've really been enjoying that. But okay, anyway, Last Crusade. Let's talk Last Crusade. So wrapping up Last Crusade, I'm going to give Last Crusade a total of 4 out of 5.
4.5 out of 5 batarangs.
I think if I went by craftsmanship, I would give it a 4 out of 5. if I went for my personal investment, I'd go 3 out of 5. So I'm going to split the difference and say 3.5 out of 5 is my rating of this one.
All right. And this issue, when it did release, was actually reviewed over on the site by Matthew. So he gave it 4.5 out of 5. So that's going to give That's going to give The Dark Knight Returns, The Last Crusade, #1, a total of 4 out of 5 batarangs. That is our one and only book this episode, because as I said, this was a special episode. So with that, we're going to wrap everything up. I encourage you to head over to the website for all the latest news related to movies, TV, merchandise, video games, and of course the comics. Also be sure to check out all of our other podcasts we have to offer. There's new episodes of Bat Books for Beginners. There's new episodes of Batgirl to Oracle, Robin Everyone Loves the Drake, and all of the other podcasts we have to offer over on the website. Also be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube for all the latest news and videos from the Batman universe. Leave us reviews on iTunes. Those are always greatly appreciated. And if you have any comments about this issue that we discussed specifically on this episode, or you have any other comments that you'd like us to touch on an upcoming episode of the Batman Universe Comic Podcast, be sure to leave your comments in the comment section below in the post on the website. With that, that is everything for this episode. This is Dustin.
This is Donovan, and thank you for having me on. Thank you for talking this story with me, and I'll catch you guys later.
This is Ian, and I invite all you Frank Miller lovers to come at me.
All right, and that is everything for this episode. So we'll see you guys just in 1 week.